The Japanese culture, the day silence fell, the city vanished in a single moment. A sudden flash of light filled the sky over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Buildings were destroyed instantly. Streets disappeared. Thousands of lives were lost before sound could even follow sight. When the light faded, the city was quiet. Not peaceful, silent. Survivors later described a strange stillness, as if the world itself had paused. Smoke rose slowly. Debris covered the ground. Familiar places were unrecognizable. Then the rain began to fall. Darkened by ash and debris, it soaked the ruins of the city. Hiroshima had become the first place in human history to experience an atomic attack. In that moment, Japan faced something no civilization had ever faced before. But this moment did not exist alone. It was shaped by centuries of belief, discipline, and endurance. To understand how Japan responded, not with chaos, but with restraint, we must look far beyond this single day. We must go back to the beginning. An island shaped by nature. Japan rises from the sea along the eastern edge of Asia. Its islands sit on unstable ground. Earthquakes are common. Volcanoes shape the land. Storms arrive without warning. The natural world here has always been powerful and unpredictable. Early communities learned quickly that survival required respect for nature. Farming depended on cooperation. Rice fields needed shared labor and shared responsibility. One failure could affect an entire village. From this reality came a core principle. The group must come before the individual. This idea became deeply rooted in daily life, shaping how people worked, lived, and made decisions. Harmony was not optional. It was necessary. The rise of discipline and order. As centuries passed, clans formed and power shifted across the islands. Conflict existed, but it followed rules. Leadership was tied to responsibility. Personal behavior reflected on the entire group. By the late medieval period, a new social class emerged, the samurai. They were warriors, but also administrators, scholars, and symbols of order. From a young age, samurai were trained to control emotion. They studied writing, ethics, and art alongside martial skills. Calmness was strength. Self-control was honor. Silence was respect. These values were formalized in ethical traditions often described as Bushido, or the way of the warrior. This code emphasized loyalty, restraint, and acceptance of responsibility, even in failure. Over time, these values spread beyond the warrior class into wider society. A culture of restraint. Japan became a culture where expression was measured. Emotion was not denied, but it was controlled. Public behavior emphasized composure. Personal feelings were kept private. Endurance was admired more than complaint. This restraint helped create stability, but it also placed limits on how suffering was expressed. Pain was endured quietly. Loss was carried internally. Duty outweighed individual grief. These patterns would shape Japan's response to future crises in profound ways. The long isolation. In the early 1600s, Japan made a defining choice. It limited contact with the outside world. Foreign influence was restricted. Trade was controlled. Travel was tightly regulated. This period became known as Sakoku, or closed country. For more than 2 centuries, Japan developed largely on its own. Art, literature, and ritual flourished. Social order remained stable. Authority was carefully maintained. But isolation also meant Japan fell behind global technological changes. When the outside world returned, it did so with force. Forced awakening. In 1853, foreign warships arrived off Japan's coast. Their message was direct: open trade or face military consequences. Japan had no modern navy capable of resistance. The country opened its borders and began a rapid transformation. Industry expanded. Military systems modernized. Education was reorganized around discipline and unity. A powerful belief took hold. Strength was necessary for survival. Fear of domination shaped national policy. Unity became essential. Obedience became a virtue reinforced by institutions. War and breaking point. In the early 20th century, Japan emerged as a major power. Conflicts in East Asia escalated. Military influence increased. National identity became closely tied to loyalty and sacrifice. During World War II, these values intensified. Surrender was considered deeply dishonorable. Endurance was emphasized even in extreme conditions. As the war turned against Japan, Cities were destroyed by conventional bombing. Resources were depleted. Civilian life became increasingly difficult. Still, surrender was delayed. Then came Hiroshima, and days later, Nagasaki. Silence after the storm. After the atomic attacks, Japan faced a reality no tradition could explain. The emperor addressed the nation publicly for the first time, announcing surrender. The war ended. What followed surprised many observers. There was no widespread unrest, no collapse of order, no public rage. Instead, Japan began rebuilding. Survivors often remained silent about their experiences. Loss was absorbed privately. Life moved forward. The world focused on recovery and growth. But beneath the surface, memory remained. In Hiroshima, shadows were left on walls and stone, marks created by intense light, preserving moments that could not be spoken. They remain today, quiet, unmoving, unforgotten. And they raise a final question. What happens when a culture teaches endurance for centuries? A nation that did not cry, Japan did not cry. When the war ended, the world waited for noise. It expected anger, grief, and chaos. Instead, Japan lowered its head. The cities were damaged. Families were gone. Many people never returned. And yet, life moved forward. Trains began to run again. Children lined up for school. Shops reopened with quiet discipline. To outsiders, this looked like strength. It looked like resilience. But inside Japan, something deeper was happening. The silence was not peace. It was survival. People had learned that emotions could be dangerous. Speaking too loudly could draw attention. Standing out could bring shame. So grief stayed hidden, locked inside homes and hearts. This silence became a second burden, one that would last far longer than the war itself. The Hibakusha. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, survivors were given a name. Hibakusha, people affected by the atomic bomb. Some carried visible scars. Others looked healthy but struggled quietly for years. Many faced long-term health challenges. But beyond the physical impact, they carried something heavier. Fear. People avoided them. Employers worried about illness. Families feared social consequences. Rumors spread, driven by misunderstanding and lack of information. As a result, many Hibakusha chose silence. They hid their past. They avoided speaking. They tried to live unnoticed. Not because they forgot, but because remembering out loud felt unsafe. In Japan, silence often meant protection. Gammon, enduring the unbearable. This silence did not begin in 1945. It had existed for centuries. Japanese culture had long praised endurance. There was a word for it, gammon. Gammon means enduring hardship with patience and dignity. It teaches self-control. It values harmony over personal expression. Children learned it early. Workers lived by it. Families depended on it. Gammon helped Japan survive disasters, wars, and poverty. But it also taught people not to speak about pain. After the war, this idea grew stronger. Suffering was seen as something to carry quietly, not something to share. Occupation and unspoken truths. After Japan surrendered, American forces occupied the country. New systems were introduced. A new constitution promised democracy and freedom of speech. On paper, Japan was free to talk. In reality, many subjects remained sensitive. Images of atomic bomb victims were restricted. Medical studies were controlled. Public discussion was limited. This was not only political, it was cultural. Japan wanted stability. The occupiers wanted order. Both feared unrest. So the past was managed carefully, and silence continued. The economic miracle, Japan rebuilt faster than anyone expected. Factories replaced ruins. Technology advanced rapidly. Cities glowed with modern light. By the 1960s, Japan was admired worldwide. Cars, electronics, trains, symbols of progress. But success came with pressure. Long work hours became normal. Rest was rare. Personal time faded. People worked not only to live, but to belong. Failure was not just personal. It reflected on family, on company, on society. The silence deepened. Karoshi. When work becomes fatal, as pressure increased, a new word entered the language. Karoshi, death from overwork. It described sudden health collapses linked to extreme stress and exhaustion. Families mourned quietly. Companies apologized. The system stayed the same. Why was there little protest? Because protest disturbed harmony. Because endurance was expected. Because silence felt safer than resistance. Japan was admired globally, but many inside were struggling. Children under pressure. The wait did not stop with adults. Children faced intense academic pressure. Exams determined futures early. Expectations were high. Mistakes felt final. Bullying often went unspoken. Stress went unnoticed. Many students felt alone. Some wrote apology notes, not in anger, but in guilt. This was not because they were weak. It was because they believed they had failed others. Silence taught them that asking for help was shameful. Beauty, control, and hidden emotion. Japanese culture values beauty and precision. The tea ceremony. Traditional theater. Calligraphy. Each demands calm focus. Emotion is controlled. Expression is subtle. Even language reflects this. Direct refusal is avoided. Criticism is softened. Discomfort is hidden behind politeness. This creates harmony, but it also hides pain. When feelings have no outlet, they turn inward. Hikikomori, disappearing quietly. In the 1990s, Japan faced economic collapse. Jobs vanished. Security ended. Identity was shaken. Some people withdrew completely. They stayed inside their rooms. Avoided society. Disconnected for years. They were called hikikomori. Families often said nothing. Neighbors looked away. Silence again felt easier than confrontation. History and memory. Beyond Japan's borders, unresolved history remained. In neighboring countries, memories of wartime suffering were still alive. Survivors demanded acknowledgement. Inside Japan, debates continued. Textbooks softened language. Words were carefully chosen. Public discussion remained divided. This was not simple denial. It was fear. Fear of shame. Fear of breaking national unity. Fear of losing face. Voices that finally spoke. Some stories refused to stay silent. Elderly women began sharing experiences they had hidden for decades. Their voices were calm, but powerful. They did not speak for anger. They spoke for truth. International attention followed. Debates intensified. Apologies were debated carefully. Inside Japan, reactions were mixed. Some listened. Some resisted. Silence began to crack. A lonely modern nation, the younger generation inherited success, but also isolation. Marriage rates fell. Birth rates declined. Loneliness increased. People were surrounded by others, but felt unseen. Technology connected screens, but not hearts. Silence had become a habit. Fukushima and familiar patterns. In 2011, disaster returned. An earthquake, a tsunami, a nuclear accident. Once again, danger was invisible. Once again, people remained calm. But confusion spread. Information was delayed. Trust weakened. Children wrote questions in diaries. Parents worried quietly. The silence felt familiar, but heavier. The cracks appear. Something is changing. Artists question tradition. Young people speak openly. Mental health conversations grow. The mask is not gone, but it is shifting. Japan is learning that endurance alone is not healing. Silence once protected the nation, but now it may be holding it back. And as history shows, when silence finally breaks, the truth is powerful. The quiet crowd. Japan is quiet, but it is never empty. In the largest cities on Earth, millions move together in near silence. Trains arrive packed, yet calm. Streets are full, yet controlled. People stand inches apart, but rarely speak. This calm is not accidental. It is learned. From a young age, Japanese people are taught how to exist around others without disturbing them. Noise is discouraged. Attention is avoided. Harmony is protected. To many visitors, this feels peaceful. To those inside it, it can feel isolating. This balance between order and loneliness did not happen by chance. It is the result of centuries of cultural conditioning. At the center of it all is obedience. Not loud obedience, not violent obedience, but quiet, invisible obedience. Ancient roots of authority. Long before modern Japan existed, survival depended on loyalty. Early Japanese society was organized around clans. Protection came from belonging. Safety came from obedience to leaders. Questioning authority was dangerous. Disobedience meant exile. Isolation meant death. Over time, obedience became more than survival. It became morality. To obey was good. To resist was shameful. This belief settled deeply into the culture and was reinforced generation after generation. The samurai mindset. When the samurai rose to power, obedience became sacred. A samurai lived for his lord. Personal desire did not matter. Emotional conflict was weakness. Duty was absolute. If ordered to fight, he fought. If ordered to die, he accepted. This was not blind cruelty. It was discipline shaped by survival and hierarchy. Even when the samurai class disappeared, the mindset remained. Obedience was no longer tied to swords. It was tied to identity. Modernization and national obedience. During the Meiji era, Japan transformed rapidly. To survive in a changing world, the government needed unity. Obedience became a tool of modernization. Schools trained children to listen without questioning. Teachers were authority. Rules were absolute. The emperor was presented as sacred. To disobey was not just wrong, it was unpatriotic. By the early 20th century, obedience was no longer personal. It was national. War and absolute compliance. During World War II, obedience reached its extreme. Soldiers followed orders without question. Civilians obeyed rationing, evacuation, and information control. Children were taught loyalty above all else. Questioning authority was dangerous. Doubt was discouraged. Harmony was survival. This obedience shaped decisions that still affect Japan's memory today. After the war, a new system, same discipline. After defeat, Japan changed on the surface. The emperor renounced divinity. A democratic constitution was written. Freedom was promised. But obedience did not disappear. It shifted. Companies replaced military units. Managers replaced commanders. Work replaced battle. Loyalty to the company became loyalty to survival. The uniform changed. The expectations did not. Work without limits. In post-war Japan, success demanded sacrifice. Long hours became normal. Rest felt irresponsible. Leaving early brought shame. People endured silently. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Some suffered serious health consequences. Some never returned home. These cases became known as karoshi, death related to overwork. They were mourned quietly. Apologies were issued. The system continued. Because obedience meant endurance. Obedience and the justice system. Authority also shaped Japan's legal culture. Interrogations prioritize confession. Pressure is intense. Resisting authority is rare. Japan's conviction rate is extremely high. To outsiders, this looks efficient. To insiders, it creates fear. Because once accused, silence feels safer than resistance. Authority is rarely challenged. When obedience is exploited, in the 1990s, obedience took a darker turn. A religious group promised purpose and truth. Its leader spoke calmly. Followers trusted completely. Many were educated professionals. They obeyed. In 1995, the group carried out a deadly attack in Tokyo's subway system. The nation was stunned. The group did not invent obedience. It exploited a cultural habit of surrendering doubt to authority. This forced Japan to ask an uncomfortable question. When obedience is absolute, who decides what is right? Schools and silent suffering. In classrooms, obedience shapes behavior. Standing out is dangerous. Difference attracts attention. Group harmony is enforced. Bullying, ijime, often targets those who break unspoken rules. Victims are encouraged to endure. Teachers hesitate to intervene. Silence is normalized. Some students internalize blame. Some disappear from school. Some leave messages apologizing for existing. Even suffering follows rules. Families and hidden pain. Inside families, obedience continues. Children respect parents. Spouses follow expectations. Elders represent tradition. Personal feelings are rarely spoken. Problems remain private. Speaking out can shame the entire family. For many, silence feels like protection, even when it hurts. A generation that feels trapped. Younger generations began to feel the pressure. They grew up safe, educated, connected, but they felt suffocated. They questioned lifelong employment, rejected traditional marriage, refused endless work. They were labeled lazy, selfish, ungrateful, but they were not rebelling loudly. They were stepping away. A quiet decline. As obedience continued, consequences appeared. Birth rates fell. Villages emptied. The population aged. Japan was not collapsing suddenly. It was shrinking quietly. Obedience preserved order, but drained energy. The internet breaks the silence. Online spaces changed everything. People spoke anonymously. Stories surfaced. Abuse was exposed. Rules were questioned. Not through chaos. Not through violence. Through persistence. Japan did not explode. It began to leak truth. Power and silence. When individuals challenged authority, resistance followed. Stories disappeared. Media hesitated. Pressure mounted. Official explanations were offered, but doubt remained, because obedience protects power, and power resists exposure. The breaking point. Across Japan, exhaustion grew. People felt pressure without release, responsibility without joy, order without meaning. Japan had mastered endurance. But endurance without expression becomes resentment, and resentment does not stay silent forever. Closing reflection, obedience built Japan. Obedience protected Japan. Obedience disciplined Japan. But obedience also limited it. Because when people are taught to endure everything, they forget how to heal. And when obedience finally breaks, it does not whisper. It shatters. A nation that learned endurance, Japan learned how to endure. From childhood, people are taught patience, restraint, and control. Emotions are shaped early, guided into acceptable forms, and softened before they can disturb others. This emotional discipline helped Japan survive disasters, wars, and rebuilding. But it also created a rule that was never written down. Feeling is allowed. Expressing is not. For generations, emotions were not denied, but postponed. Anger was delayed. Grief was hidden. Fear was masked by politeness. Over time, endurance replaced expression. And endurance, when it becomes permanent, creates a quiet pressure. Success on the surface. By the early 2000s, Japan appeared stable and prosperous. Cities were safe. Infrastructure was advanced. Daily life was orderly. To the world, Japan looked calm and balanced. But emotional health does not always reflect material success. Beneath the surface, many felt disconnected, not from society, but from themselves. This disconnection did not explode. It settled. Loneliness as a social condition. Loneliness became widespread, but rarely acknowledged. Many people lived alone, worked alone, ate alone. Some passed away without anyone noticing. This phenomenon came to be known as kodakushi, or lonely death. It was not caused by neglect alone. It was shaped by culture. In Japan, asking for help can feel like burdening others. Depending on someone can feel like failure. So many chose quiet disappearance over visible need. The culture of self-erasure. These individuals were not ignored. They withdrew. They stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped being visible, not because they were unwanted, but because they believed they should not impose. In a society that values harmony, absence feels safer than need. A younger generation learns the same lesson. Young people observed this silence closely. They watched parents endure long hours, hide stress, avoid emotional conversation. The lesson was clear. Do not complain. Do not demand. Do not disrupt. Many internalized this message deeply. Some retreated into isolation. Some withdrew socially. Some lived primarily through digital spaces. Not as rebellion, but as protection. A nation surrounded, yet alone, Japan became densely populated and emotionally distant. People shared trains, but not conversations. Apartments, but not connection. Workspaces, but not vulnerability. The result was not chaos. It was quiet emptiness. Love under pressure, intimacy declined. Marriage rates fell. Birth rates dropped. Relationships became cautious. Many cited exhaustion. Others fear. Some uncertainty. But beneath these explanations was something deeper. Love requires emotional risk. Risk requires openness. Openness had never been encouraged. People learned roles, not emotional fluency. Women and silent expectation. For generations, women were expected to support quietly, to endure social pressure, to balance work and family, to minimize discomfort. Legal reforms advanced. Cultural habits lagged. Speaking openly often carried consequences. So silence continued, until some began to speak. The first cracks in the mask. Gradually, voices emerged. Not confrontational, not explosive, personal. Women shared experiences of pressure, discrimination, and exhaustion. Mothers spoke about unrealistic expectations. Workers described quiet inequality. These stories challenged the idea that harmony meant fairness. Japan hesitated, not from denial, but from discomfort. Masculinity and emotional restriction. Men also carried heavy expectations. They were taught to provide, to endure, to succeed quietly. When employment faltered, identity weakened. Some withdrew, some isolated, some lost direction. The issue was not failure. It was the inability to express it. Shame as emotional weight. Japan's struggle with suicide has often been misunderstood. It is not simply about sadness. It is about shame, about perceived burden, about failing expectations. Many final messages contain apologies. Even in distress, responsibility remained central. Art as emotional language. When direct expression felt difficult, creativity filled the gap. Films explored isolation. Music addressed numbness. Manga examined escape and emotional fatigue. These works were not protests. They were reflections. Art became the place where emotions were allowed to exist openly. A generation that asked questions. A new generation began to quietly question norms. Not through confrontation, but through lifestyle choices. They worked fewer hours, delayed marriage, redefined success. They were not rejecting society. They were searching for balance. The return of historical emotion. As emotional expression grew, historical memory resurfaced. Unresolved war narratives, suppressed testimonies, uncomfortable questions. These stories challenged identity. They forced Japan to consider complexity instead of simplicity, learning to feel without endurance. Young people began discussing mental health, seeking counseling, sharing vulnerability. To older generations, this felt unfamiliar. To younger ones, it felt necessary. Expression was no longer weakness. It was survival, resistance to emotional change. Not everyone welcomed this shift. Institutions resisted. Power structures hesitated. Silence defended itself. Because silence had protected authority. And authority rarely surrenders quietly. When truth meets resistance, some stories never reached the public. Investigations stalled. Articles disappeared. Careers ended quietly. No dramatic confrontation. Just absence. Silence, once again. Japan's emotional paradox. Japan values honesty and trust, yet avoids emotional exposure. It prizes harmony, yet struggles with unspoken pain. It endured everything, yet forgot how to release. This contradiction defines the present moment. A crossroads. Japan now stands between two paths. Continue enduring, or begin expressing. Hold silence, or face complexity. Neither path is easy, but only one allows healing. Closing reflection. The question is no longer whether Japan can endure. It always has. The question is whether it can finally allow itself to feel. Because emotions denied do not disappear. They wait. And when they return changed. A nation that refused to end. Japan has always survived. Across centuries, it endured forces that erased other civilizations. Empires collapsed. Cities burned. Natural disasters reshaped the land. War pushed the nation to its limits. Yet Japan did not disappear. Survival became more than instinct. It became identity. A shared understanding passed quietly from one generation to the next. Endure. Adapt. Remain. This philosophy shaped everything that followed. The method of survival. Japan survived by choosing restraint over reaction, by bowing instead of confronting, by remaining silent instead of shouting, by placing collective stability above individual expression. This was not weakness. For centuries, it worked. Order was preserved. Communities held together. Chaos was minimized. But survival strategies do not remain harmless forever. A new kind of enemy. For the first time, Japan faces something it cannot defeat through discipline alone. Not invasion, not disaster, not economic collapse. It faces reflection, a reckoning with habits that once protected it, but now quietly exhaust it. This challenge cannot be outrun. Morning in the modern capital. At dawn, Tokyo moves with precision. Trains arrive on time. Streets remain orderly. Millions step into familiar routines. On the surface, nothing appears broken. Yet something subtle has shifted. The calm feels heavier. The silence less peaceful. Japan is no longer rebuilding. It is questioning. The first signs of change, the change did not arrive dramatically. It came quietly. A worker declining unpaid overtime. A student choosing passion over prestige. A woman setting boundaries once considered unacceptable. These were not acts of rebellion. They were moments of refusal. A definition begins to fade. For generations, identity in Japan was clear. Worth came from contribution. Belonging came from obedience. Meaning came from endurance. Today, those definitions are losing certainty. Young people ask questions once left unspoken, not out of disrespect, but out of uncertainty. Questions without precedent. Who am I without constant productivity? What if endurance is harming me? What if harmony requires honesty? These questions unsettle a culture built on stability, because they cannot be answered through tradition alone. A shrinking nation. Japan's population is declining. Villages empty. Schools close. Care systems strain under pressure. The same structure that once thrived on obedience now needs empathy, creativity, and openness. Skills rarely prioritized before. Institutional adaptation. Authorities attempt reform. Work hour limits are announced. Mental health awareness grows. Family incentives increase. But policy moves faster than culture. And culture does not respond to instruction. It responds to permission. Permission to speak. Permission to feel. Permission to fail. Classrooms without fear. In schools, something has changed. Students question rules. Challenge unfairness. Speak openly about emotions. Educators trained under older systems feel uncertain. The tools of shame and silence no longer hold power. And without them, authority must redefine itself. The collapse of old promises. The promise of lifelong security has faded. Jobs no longer guarantee stability. Loyalty is no longer rewarded. Endurance does not ensure protection. For many, this feels like betrayal. A social contract quietly dissolved. A dangerous realization. When a culture built on endurance realizes endurance is no longer rewarded, something shifts. Trust erodes. Motivation weakens. Silence turns inward. This moment is critical because disillusionment spreads faster than anger. Media finds a new voice. Journalism begins to adjust. Stories emerge about burnout, about emotional neglect, about failure without shame. Not aggressively, not recklessly, but consistently. Each story challenges the illusion that silence equals strength. The past speaks again. Voices from history return. Survivors speak. Documents resurface. Uncomfortable truths reappear. The world listens closely. Japan hesitates. Acknowledging these truths means reshaping national memory. And memory, in Japan, is deeply tied to honor. Disaster and doubt. Natural disasters continue. Japan responds with discipline and coordination. But afterward, questions emerge. Why was information delayed? Why were warnings softened? Why was certainty prioritized over transparency? Trust weakens. And trust is difficult to restore once broken. Quiet reflection. In private spaces, individuals reflect. On parents who never spoke openly. On pain never expressed. On lives shaped more by obligation than choice. This reflection is not loud, but it is widespread. The cost of endurance. Japan's greatest loss may not be material. It may be emotional. Dreams postponed indefinitely. Words never spoken. Lives lived carefully, but not fully. This realization is difficult, but it is also necessary. The shape of hope. Hope appears quietly. In emotional honesty. In apologies between generations. In vulnerability once considered unacceptable. These moments do not reject tradition. They reinterpret it. A new balance. A new culture begins to form. One that values harmony without silence. Endurance without self-erasure. Respect without fear. This balance is fragile, but it is possible. The choice. Japan now faces a decision made not by leaders, but by individuals. To continue enduring without expression, or to heal through honesty, to protect silence, or to allow truth. Closing reflection. Silence built Japan, but silence can no longer sustain it. The future will not judge Japan for what it endured. It will remember what Japan finally allowed itself to feel. History is watching, and Japan must choose.